Over the weekend, allies of President Trump threatened to issue new subpoenas, demanded a second special counsel, and even warned the president of a setup, all in reaction to a New York Times report that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein discussed wearing a wire to secretly record conversations with President Trump and discussed invoking the 25th Amendment to oust him in the days after the FBI Director James Comey was fired in May of 2017. The Times report is partly based off memos written by FBI officials, including then Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, who declined to comment but denied being a source. Yesterday, House Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte set a deadline for the Justice Department to turn them over. Joining us now is member of the Judiciary Committee, Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, and former Justice Department spokesman, now an MSNBC Justice and Security Analyst, Matt Miller. Matt, I want to start with you to set up our questions for Senator Blumenthal. Talk about the report about Rod Rosenstein discussing and using the words 25th Amendment. Is the story that Rod Rosenstein potentially said that, or is it broader? What's your gut?
You know, the way I read this story is it really is a sign of the turmoil that was going on in the department in those 8 days after Jim Comey was fired and before Bob Mueller was appointed, and especially the turmoil going on around Rod Rosenstein. You know, it is hard to imagine a deputy attorney general who kind of is in complete command of the situation, suggesting seriously that he wear a wire, or that Andy McCabe or someone else going into the Oval Office wear a wire, or that, or invoking the 25th Amendment when he's not even a member of the cabinet. The Deputy Attorney General wouldn't have a role in that situation. So I think a lot of people have interpreted that to mean that he wasn't being serious. And of course, DOJ has tried very hard to imply and put out statements on background that he wasn't being serious. I think the more accurate read of it, and I base this on conversations with people at the department at the time, and I think if you read closely the Times story, it comes through, is that Rod Rosenstein wasn't kind of in complete command of the situation then. He was in a lot of ways a ship without port. I think he didn't understand the ramifications of his memo after he wrote it and saw it used as the excuse to fire Comey. He was deeply criticized by alumni of the Justice Department. I think he took it to heart, and I think he was really kind of floundering around in that week trying to figure out what to do. And the answer he ultimately came up with is to appoint Bob Mueller, but I think he was really struggling during that time period, and I think it comes through in the accounts of that meeting, both from the Justice Department side and from the side of whoever else is talking to the Times.
All right, Senator Blumenthal, we're going to get to the latest on the Brett Kavanaugh concerns in just a moment, but I want to ask you about this Rod Rosenstein New York Times report, because based on the sort of the behavior of the president that we have been witnessing, that I've witnessed firsthand, that I've seen and heard myself from people inside the White House or from the president himself, what are the chances Rod Rosenstein is the only person who has uttered the words 25th Amendment?
There may be others who've uttered those words since Rod Rosenstein spoke about it within the White House, but the 25th Amendment is a very high burden to use, and the kind of procedure, let alone evidence, that's required for the whole cabinet to go to the Congress and ask for, in effect, a temporary replacement of the president, which the president can then overcome, and they have to come back again. I think Rod Rosenstein was very well aware that it was a cumbersome and difficult process. At the same time, for him even to remark about it in jest or with sarcasm shows the kind of turmoil existing at the time. And I recall it very well because I voted against Rod Rosenstein when he refused to commit to me as a member of the Judiciary Committee that he would appoint a special counsel. Ultimately, he did. And the agenda here on the part of the Trump administration is to subvert or sabotage that special counsel. Rod Rosenstein is in charge of the budget, the indictments, all of the charges that are brought. He is the key figure here.
NBC's Andrea Mitchell, jump in.
Well, I also have some questions about Andrew McCabe, because he was writing the memo. It was based on his memos. He was fired by Rod Rosenstein. He's now under investigation. According to the Inspector General, he may have committed perjury. We don't know, but a grand jury is looking into him right now. So one should probably take these memos with a grain of salt?
They really should be taken with a grain of salt. That's a very, very good point. That was my first reaction when I saw that Andrew McCabe was involved. At the same time, even people with questionable motives may have verifiable things to say. And in this instance, the point is, I think, most important, that we need to protect the special counsel and the Department of Justice investigation.
Do you think that this is, in part, to try to get him out of there? Is that one of the motivations?
I think it may well be. Ultimately, one of the reasons that the president will emphasize the importance of it and why he will attack Rod Rosenstein and, of course, Jeff Sessions in the process.
Senator, Thursday is shaping up to be a big day in American history, not just the United States Senate, when the Judiciary Committee reconvenes and is going to hear from Dr. Ford. Whether or not the country believes her, we'll find out later. But the question I have for you is that everything that's going on, the back and forth between Senator Grassley and various people asking for more time, asking for a delayed process so there can be further background checks conducted by the FBI. Who is more in charge of the show on the Republican side, Senator Grassley or Mitch McConnell?
I wish I knew. And most of my colleagues wish they knew who is really in charge here. And if somebody's in charge who really wants to uncover the truth, they would tell the White House, we need an FBI investigation. These sexual assault survivors have come forward with tremendous courage, knowing the nightmare of public shaming, character assassination, death threats, other kinds of jeopardy to public safety, and they are entitled to a respectful hearing. But equally important, the Judiciary Committee and the U.S. Senate are entitled to an FBI investigation by trained professionals.
Is the partisanship now, though, so hyper, so exaggerated on both sides here, that there are members of the Judiciary Committee who cannot figure out that we are not talking about the appointment of the Postmaster General here? We're talking about a lifetime appointment.
We're talking about a lifetime appointment to the nation's highest court that will make a real difference in real people's lives for generations, literally generations to come with this appointment. And so we have a constitutional duty to get to the bottom of these allegations. They are serious and credible. And now the person with the most knowledge about them, namely Judge Brett Kavanaugh, has a responsibility to come forward with evidence to rebut them. They have control over whether to have an investigation. They have control over whether Mark Judd is subpoenaed to testify, whether other witnesses are required to come forward. This investigation has to bring those other witnesses before the United States Senate, and so there need to be other hearings.
Senator, your colleague, Senator Mazie Hirono, over the weekend was asked if the presumption of innocence was due to Brett Kavanaugh. She replied by saying that I take his entire philosophy into view. I'm paraphrasing, essentially saying that his judicial philosophy also informed her opinion about whether or not these events occurred as they are alleged by these two accusers. This is not a court of law, obviously. The burden of evidence is not beyond a shadow of a doubt. But to what extent should we apply an evidentiary standard here? Does Judge Kavanaugh deserve the presumption of innocence? Is his judicial views informing the senators how they view these accusations fair and accurate and just?
Great question, and let's break it down. First of all, we're dealing here with a confirmation for a lifetime appointment to the nation's highest court, a promotion. We're dealing with confirmation, not conviction. So the standard is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In this instance, Judge Kavanaugh can rebut these allegations. They're serious and credible with the kinds of evidence that is within his control. You know, there's a doctrine of law that says the party that controls the evidence after there's a prima facie case made has a duty to come forward. It's the burden of production. And you can analogize it here. I don't want to talk too much legalese, but there is a burden on the part of the White House to do the investigation. What are they hiding? What are they afraid the American people will see? And there's a pattern here because it follows his evasive and misleading seemingly misleading testimony before the Judiciary Committee, and the concealing of 2 million pages of documents that I'm now in court trying to uncover through the Freedom of Information Act.
All right, Senator Richard Blumenthal, thank you so much for being on the show this morning.
Thank you.
And coming up, Donald Trump is reacting to the Rod Rosenstein report, and like he did with Brett Kavanaugh, he's holding his fire, at least to begin with. We'll show you what he said next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.